Hello, Steve. Welcome to the podcast. So, there are going to be a lot of people who are listening in the audience who maybe don't know who you are and they don't really know much about your coaching background. So, would you like to engage listeners and tell them all about yourself and how you got into powerlifting, how you got into coaching, and what brings you here today?
Yeah, so kind of give a brief introduction. My name's Steve De Novi. If you don't know me from my name, PRS Performance is kind of my brand that I've kind of been behind, as well as decently well known as the podcast I host with Angelo Fortino called Two White Lights. You may not know me outside of anything as Angelo's boyfriend. Some people refer to me simply as that, and I'm completely okay with that. I am his boy toy, so I'm cool with that stipulation. So, but yeah, I'm a powerlifting coach first, but I do a lot of really cool things with content, whether it's YouTube, also a platform on Powerlifting Now, where I do with Sean Noriega, Marcellus Williams, and Matt Cronin, where we do a lot of informative content that I call a little bit higher level, that kind of appeals to kind of people looking for advanced knowledge within powerlifting, whether you're a lifter or a coach. But yeah, kind of how I got into this. So I've actually got my MBA in marketing. I had zero plan to ever do this, ever. But obviously you guys are in Ireland, so I don't know how the situation was economically then during this time, but like 2006-ish to 2011 when I graduated from my undergrad degree and then graduated from 2010 to 2011, undergrad and then my postgrad, we were very much in like a recession in the sense of like job market was absolutely terrible. And I just couldn't find anything. It just was not a good time to graduate. It didn't matter that I had a good educational background. Honestly, having a marketing degree doesn't mean anything in the first place. That doesn't really get you a job. So either way, while I was working on my graduate degree, I was just working part-time as a personal trainer because I just had a really extreme passion for lifting. I mean, at that time, I was just utterly obsessed with lifting. Like every decision I made in my entire life was based around my lifting schedule. And frankly, that's almost one of the reasons I went to grad school is I didn't really want to work yet because that would mess with my lifting schedule. Like I really thought I was going to be a pro natural bodybuilder. But looking back, I barely looked like I lifted, let alone pro natural bodybuilder, but I tried. I tried really, really hard. A lot of people nowadays, they look at, I'm not really known for being the coach that looks like he power lifts, and I don't train in the same way I used to. I train a lot more just for enjoyment back for about 10 years, like my entire life revolved around lifting. Like if I had any level of like semi-decent genetics, I would have been a pretty good athlete. It just wasn't in the cards for me, but I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Still couldn't get a job. I don't get in the whole situation. There was a lot of weird situations. And basically, I needed to get insurance because I was going to get kicked off my parents' insurance because I was 25. And in the U.S., you can no longer be on their insurance. So I started managing Gold's Gyms, if you're familiar with that. I think that's a pretty decently well-known worldwide brand from Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I managed Gold's Gyms and fitness staffs for about 5 or 6 years. And honestly, I loved it. I was going to keep doing that. I was actually very much on track and probably within the next year going to go to more of a regional position and overseeing fitness managers throughout an entire region. But then I met my wife, and within 3 months we were engaged. Only reason we weren't married as just as quick is because she had to finish out her graduate school, and then as soon as she graduated, we got married and moved, and I started over. Like we moved to a smaller town where I'm at. Comparatively, I tried to kind of do the personal training here, and frankly, when I did it, it just wasn't going to happen. Personal training relies a lot on the fact that like you have to have a surplus of clients who have enough money to pay. But we had the opposite. We had a surplus of trainers and not enough people who had the money to pay. So like it just was not a good situation. And I realized fairly quickly personal training is not a situation that I continue to want to do here. And I didn't even know if I really had a passion for personal training specifically, like working with middle-aged women who don't want to be at the gym, who have every excuse in the books. I kind of was grumpy at that point. I'm still pretty grumpy to this day, but I was definitely grumpy at that point where I just didn't really have the tolerance to deal with that, as well as I'm good in like this podcast format and public speaking. If you meet me in real life, I'm decently introverted. I'm not the most I'm personable, but like I did not have the skill set that a lot of personal trainers need of just being like overly personable and like most trainers that are really successful, it's almost more personality based, where my competitive advantage was knowledge. But that doesn't really help you in personal training. Like there's a very low level of knowledge you need to help a general population, middle-aged person trying to lose weight. And so like what I was doing really wasn't helping me like in that field. Either way, This is back 2014 to 15, right when powerlifting really kind of like was kind of getting its launch in the sense of like Raw and the IPF and like that kind of stuff. And I had gotten into it because that made way more sense to me. I sucked at bodybuilding. I still sucked at powerlifting, but I loved the objective, like analytical database, and like it's very like, I do this and I get better versus I'm going to pose 4 times a day in the mirror and see if my tricep horseshoe changed at all. And then 6 years later, it looks the exact same, but I'm got body dysmorphia and hoping it's bigger. So either way, I started coaching some people for free because there wasn't, I mean, this is right when it started. There wasn't really that many online coaches doing it. There definitely wasn't very many coaches in the state I was in. And I just kind of coached people for free because I was the guy that powerlifted. So people said, hey, teach me how to do it. And then after moving and with my wife and realizing personal training wasn't in the cards, she just kind of was the one that pushed me. She's like, hey, try and do this. Like, I'm in a really good situation where financially my wife's income fully supported us. If I made more, awesome. If I didn't, not a big deal. So she pushed me to it. And I won't give the full scenario of the progression, but like it worked out really, really well. There was a lot of things I did. We actually just did a podcast on Powerlifting Now talking about like starting up and building a coaching business. I think we gave a lot of background there. So I'm going to semi-plug that, not necessarily to get more money, but legitimately I thought it was a really good podcast for people who want to do that, as well as I have like 5 hours of free YouTube stuff on building a coaching business. And I give a decent background there. But yeah, I built it up and it went really well. I don't know how. Like, I think everything about me doesn't scream powerlifting coach. I didn't come from an area that necessarily had too many notable people. I don't really have a good competitive background. I think I just did a lot of things in a good way, and I think I hit some good spots of luck there that kind of helped propel stuff, and I've been very, very fortunate in what I do. So, yeah.
No, I suppose kind of you said a couple of things there I would agree with. I suppose it depends on being in the right time, the right place. You kind of catch a wave, I suppose. And I suppose while me and Shane are kind of maybe only coaching powerlifters maybe 3 or 4 years, we are still on that, still feels like we're on that upward trajectory where powerlifting is still growing. And but when you said something about the personality, I suppose it's one thing I kind of see consistently in coaches nearly across all sports, that you kind of have this idea that it's the classically extroverted person that's loud and I suppose like you said at the extreme end of personable, but when you're standing in a warm-up room at a powerlifting meet and you're kind of loosely making eye contact with people and you're getting chatty, you kind of realize very, very quickly that the median or the mode in powerlifters is probably a heavily introverted person that probably isn't too interested in having small talk. But it's not, I suppose it's not something you would expect personality wise, but it does play a big part in developing that the types of relationships you'd hope to build with your clients. That maybe that more introverted, kind of more selective type of personality does lend itself to building those kind of deeper, stronger bonds than maybe someone at the other end.
Yeah, because frankly, if you had the personality to personal train or at least be in the more general population side, a lot more money there. I don't think you get, if anyone's trying to get into powerlifting coaching because they think that's where the gold mine of fitness money is, that's very, very wrong. The gold mine's in the general population side. So if you have the ability to push on that side, albeit you have to deal with a very different type of clientele, that's kind of where you want to be. But yeah, kind of to your point too, I mean, it's getting harder and harder to break through with coaching because there's a lot more competition. I mean, frankly, predating me, because I'm honestly not in that initial wave that kind of came up. Frankly, some of those coaches are incredibly popular for the simple fact that there just wasn't anything else then. Like, I mean, there was only a few people who had really kind of gotten in the online coaching realm in that first initial kind of wave. Then there was kind of a second wave that I feel like I was a part of. And even with myself, I felt like I had to differentiate myself. And my big driver was like, I'm not strong. I'm not popular, nor does anyone know who I am. The only differentiating factor is that I'm going to try and create the perception that I'm smarter than everyone. And perception's the key there. I'm not saying I'm smarter than everyone. I've got to create the perception that I am. That has to be my comparative advantage over other people. And that's why I dove into doing the long-form content stuff that, frankly, people weren't doing I don't know if I want to say I'm the first one to do it, but like no one was making long Instagram captions. I started doing that because I realized that blog posts were dead. I used to write for Elite FTS. I used to write for some other websites, and I realized quickly, I was like, oh, I thought if I write for Elite FTS, I'm going to get super popular. And I quickly realized that's not happening. Like no one's really caring about this stuff anymore. So I started kind of going more into the end of, okay, let's try writing blog posts on Instagram, since that's where everyone's at. And it works super well. And now that's like a common thing we see people do, as well as on YouTube. Everyone that was doing YouTube content was doing like 5 to 10 minute videos. And I was like, okay, if I put out a 5-10 minute video, all I'm doing is competing with those same people and saying the exact same things. Let's do hour-long videos. Hit a market that, you know what, it's smaller. That's a smaller niche. But those are people that likely have higher loyalty and higher ROI, because if they're willing to sit through an hour-long video, they're also someone who's willing to likely invest more into their education and their future as a powerlifter versus someone who can barely make it through a 5-minute video and then complain that you didn't help their squat because the 5-minute video didn't help you. So there was a lot of very specific things I went towards, and that I think you have to do as a coach now, which is even harder because you've got me making long-form content. You've got the short-form content. You've got people who are more based on like their popularity. It's just harder now. It is going to be a bit more difficult to kind of come up because there's so much competition, and there's frankly, powerlifting is not that big in the grand scheme of things. There's not a ton of room for everyone to be successful, but it's always interesting. So
yeah, I absolutely agree in regards to like the long form content being like the way to make yourself stand out, because it is very easy to like make short form content like in terms of like the lowest viable product, right? But to make stuff that is going to make people very engaged, especially from a powerlifting context, like say for example, a lot of your videos centered around like technique, programming, you can't really get really hard hitting nuanced points in like 30 seconds in like an Instagram video, right? You need to have those longer form content. And as you said there, if somebody is not willing to sit through like a 5-minute video, like to improve their squat, which they maybe do multiple times per week, and the weight in the bar, their performance in powerlifting means a huge deal to them, like that person is probably not going to be the person who buys from you at the end of the day, right? So producing that longer form content, something that, again, a little bit more meaningful, something that's going to make you stand out, giving yourself the time to actually make it. Like if 100 people watch that but 10 people end up becoming a client, like that's pretty good return on investment, right? Whereas if you have the 5-minute video and 10 times as many people watch it, but then you got like people signing up who actually aren't looking for the longer term investment of what you get from coaching, right? Or they're not as receptive to taking on your advice because they don't have the same buy-in, because they're looking for the kind of quicker fix. Like it's worth putting the time into that kind of longer form of content,
Yep. Just really knowing who your audience is and who to target and whatnot. Because like even going from the progression of me coaching, I very much just focused locally for a very long time, which I did a very good job at. Like in the local scene, like I was the guy. I hosted the meets. I was the coach. Then I spread it out a little bit more within the state I was in. And I never really thought I was going to get outside of that. It grew, but you have to understand who you're targeting, because you can get 100,000 views on a video, but if the 100,000 people watching it are not the right people, you get nothing out of it, versus you could get 500 views on a video and it can be the most impactful video you have. Like actually my coaching videos, my 2 business coaching videos on YouTube are some of my least watched, but I actually know for a fact, based on people contacting me, it could be the most impactful ones I've ever done, because the 50 people who watched those and were able to quit their jobs and able to be now full-time powerlifting coaches from following that format. I'm not taking credit for that. I mean, it was their hard work, but at least giving them an idea of how to start. That is more impactful than the 100,000 view video that someone might have that like people watch, but like how many people really like changed their life or really made a big difference for them. So you got likes and views and all that stuff is somewhat of a mirage, aka why I'm anti-reel, and I make fun of reels all the time because it's just kind of like a lot of fake likes. Not always the most liked or like seemingly popular content is actually what's getting you the most. It sometimes is the ones that are very targeted to the right people that is what's getting you the biggest impact there. So
some of the most successful coaches have like the smallest followings, and like they have a full client roster, whereas like those who could have like tens or hundreds of thousands of followers could still be struggling to make money off clients, because again, they could be attracting the wrong people because they're putting out the either not necessarily the wrong content, but like they're trying to play to the marketing machine of like Instagram, right? Anyway,
yep.
We talked a decent bit about like the kind of, I suppose, the marketing side of coaching. But I suppose the topic of content, or the topic of today's conversation we want to talk about is technique, right? And you have tons of really, really good in-depth videos on technique on your YouTube channel. Like if you're listening, head over, follow Steve. Like you can pretty much like coach yourself just by following his content. But I suppose when you are starting off with a client and they're coming to you, what do you look at first when it comes to like technique? Like how do you assess good technique, bad technique? What is technique? What are the kind of minimum standards that you're looking to get that person to? And then how do you move them towards being more efficient? Look, big question, but
yeah. So I'll start with to kind of set kind of a foundation here, and this goes back to one of the YouTube videos I had, and it took me a really long time to get to this point. But like, what is good technique? Because that was kind of like a debate over the last 3-4 years. Some people are like, there's no such thing as good technique. There kind of was like a little bit of a shift in the spectrum to some people like almost kind of saying technique doesn't matter and it shouldn't be something we're overly focusing on. And then you had the opposite side that was like overly focused on technique. And you always got to be careful not to like shift too far on that, like that paradox of like which way you're going. And so I was like, okay, there's got to be some type of like happy medium here. I probably, if I was to put it, I was probably on the end of like being too much on like highly technical. And I was like, I might actually being too overly focused here. How can I kind of shift and like narrow my focus of like what I actually need to worry about? And that's where I kind of came together of like it's kind of like a 3 bullet point of like what is good technique is. 1, does it meet powerlifting standards? We're powerlifting. So like if you're outside powerlifting, this doesn't necessarily always apply, but if you're in powerlifting, you have to meet the standards of the 3 lifts. Like that's just a bare minimum. You cannot call a lift that cannot get white lights good technique. It just simply is not. I can't see any argument of saying not hitting squat depth is good technique in powerlifting. Like you can't compete. Like bomb out. So that just seems like bare minimum. 1, you have to lift to powerlifting standards and abide by the rules. Number 2, and this just goes back to, I don't even have any background in physics. I couldn't even tell you like most of what I'm talking about here, like the actual like scientific realm of it, but I have at least a good enough understanding to understand that gravity is a pretty important aspect of powerlifting. That's literally everything we're doing here is managing some form of mass within context of gravity, and gravity is a vertical pull. Like we're not really getting poured horizontally or pulled like in different directions. We are an extent in the sense of like bar position, but like straight gravity, the bar's trying to go down. So that's what we're trying to fight against. And within that, we're trying to be as well balanced as possible over our center of mass. And that is a bit of a conversation, especially when you get into bench press. I've kind of talked about that on some other podcasts, like what is center of mass on bench press, because it's kind of hard to be able to talk about. Same with squat when you're talking low bar versus high bar and deadlift. Either way, we're trying to manage center of mass, because I don't think there's an argument that if you go too far deviating forward or back from your center of mass, it's going to create problems. If you go too far forward, you're literally, like on squat, you're literally going to fall forward into the rack. If you go too far back, you're literally going to fall backwards. So there's a spectrum or some type of like degree of that center of mass that you want to stay within that's likely going to be able to allow you to be the most stable fighting against gravity as possible while handling this weight. So that's kind of the biggest thing I'm looking for with most people when I first see them. Like there's some things that we can do as well that I don't want to get too nuanced in, but the main thing I'm looking for is, are they managing their center of mass well? And if they're not, what can we do to improve that? Because just based on physics, I've had people argue that center of mass is not relevant because like we have no scientific evidence that it is. I'm like, yeah, we do. We have physics. Like we literally have an entire study of physics that say it. Yes, we do not have powerlifting studies that have completely developed a law of physics for squatting a barbell, nor will we ever, because physicists do not care about that. But we have laws of physics, and we know that, being able to manage that center of mass, be the most stable, and move that in the most like efficient manner is likely going to allow us to display force and strength in the best way. And then the last kind of point I have there is, this is kind of a little bit more controversial, but like, does it cause pain? I do believe that technique can correlate with pain. It does not cause it, but it can correlate. Some type of musculature past its tolerable limit of workload. And that most of the time is going to be related on just general programming. Like, we're just doing too much. But with technique, I'm going to go far off in the spectrum. If you literally only squatted on one leg and the other leg was doing nothing, I think we can all agree that one leg is taking a lot more workload than the leg that's doing nothing. Would you all agree on that? Therefore, based on our technique, one leg is receiving more workload, and we very well could push that leg's workload past its tolerable limit, while the other leg is completely underdosed because we're not even using it. Now, that's an extreme. Most people are not going to do a single leg squat, but that's my point. There's a spectrum that if we shift the muscular stress too much due to our technique in some manner, we're going to have an issue. It could be myself. I have super long arms and no arch on bench press. I have a very low workload for a close grip bench press, if none at all, because of the range of motion and how that's stressing my musculature versus if I'm in a slightly wider grip. So we can look at that too, of how are we stressing the musculature to be able to allow the highest tolerance for workload, because if we have the highest tolerance for workload, the assumption will be we have the highest ability and ceiling to push our strength. So that's something that's a bit more complex, but I do very much believe that's a thing, and I think, frankly, that's a bit hard to argue based on, like I said, there's a spectrum. I understand, like, a slight little hip shift doesn't mean you're getting injured, but there's something there in some way where technique can shift workload management on musculature that could possibly result in pain. Or, like I said, I mean, it could just be like anatomically. I can't wide stance squat. If a coach told me I had to wide stance squat, I guarantee you my right hip is probably going to be hurting pretty quickly because anatomically my hips do not open up very far. So, like, there's aspects of technique that could correlate to creating workload issues which cause pain. So those are really the three things I'm going to look at, and then try and base everything around that and simplify it, because even though that was kind of a long talk, I think that's a pretty simple way to go about it versus having 300 different cues and you're going to try and decide which one's going to work for an athlete. I'm just going to try and base everything around, does it abide by powerlifting rules? Do they manage their center of mass well? And does it cause any pain? And then if it doesn't have any issues there, like I don't know if there's really even a reason to change it. But if it does, how can we find the most simple way to adjust to abide within those?
You said there as the rule one of having to meet the powerlifting standards is a massive one. I've had a couple of clients where they'll say, no, this squat or this deadlift feels really, really nice, and you're kind of saying, look, you can't really squat to depth, you're not locking out your deadlifts here, so there's something that's in your technique that's preventing you from lifting to the standards. The third point, I think, is quite a good one, where you would have said maybe injury or pain. I would use the word comfort. Like, you'll have someone and they'll get into low bar position after 2 weeks. They're like, I can't get my hand behind my shoulder anymore with the pain. So sometimes it is kind of maybe, it is going to be a comfort thing where maybe I can get into this position. It maybe doesn't look as pretty, but it's a little bit more comfortable. I'm a little bit more consistent in the setup as well. So I think you've kind of broken that down pretty nicely.
Yeah, and even something with like low bar I've talked about, I do this a lot because that's a very common thing. It not to be a technique thing, it's just like, okay, their technique is good on low bar, it's just they can only handle so much workload in that position before not only does it hurt their squat, it hurts their bench press. I love doing like top set low bar and then reversing back to like high bar or a safety bar if someone's willing to unload the weight for the rest of their work. And like kind of getting back to like the conjugate days, and like we're all kind of coming back to fruition where they would do their heavy squat and then they do like 6 different variations in their board. It makes sense. Like they weren't doing it for that reason. They were doing it to address weakness, but I don't think they realized that in reality they were also addressing workload. How were they able to handle more workload? And so can this lifter handle more workload by not doing just solely low bar squatting, but now doing their back offs high bar so that they're not beating up their shoulders, and now they're able to handle more squat volume because we're not limiting it by a musculature that really doesn't need to be limited in the squat. So, but
yeah, the tolerance to certain techniques, I suppose. And I suppose it is our job as coaches, and you touched on it there, where you might have someone and they've a lovely low bar squat, but they could maybe handle 2 or 3 sets a week on that before, again, the position starts to affect their bench, which I suppose if your squat is starting to affect your bench, you're maybe looking at doing something wrong. But I think in particular where I see this a lot is in people that will pull sumo. They'll have really, really nice technique maybe for a couple of sets. And then there's a point of diminishing returns when the whole thing starts to go to trash. And even where you would have said you might have people doing maybe like a top set on a low bar squat and you might change to a safe squat bar. I've had people where, or instances where the lifter can only tolerate a couple of sets of sumo, and similarly to that, you might conjugate your way out of that and have them doing some conventional pulls or block pulls as a proxy for their sumo.
Yeah. And actually, kind of skipping ahead in my notes because I think it kind of translates here in what we're kind of talking about, because I know you guys kind of had some discussion on wanting to cue. And I honestly don't cue too much. I don't use that often. And kind of one of the notes I had that fits really well with kind of what you were saying there is too often I think coaches give cues to get the lifter to fix their own technique versus the coach giving them the ability to self-align their technique in the best way possible. And so what I mean by that is if you give a lifter, like let's say you put them on a program where they're constantly in really high fatigue. You kind of mentioned that there, that over sets, technique diminishes. Well, technique is diminishing because as fatigue accumulates, we start to see the masking of technique and the inability for a lifter to be able to kind of manage positions in the same way. Or if they're just chronically fatigued over the entire week, like I see so many times that I mean, this happens even when you're not chronically fatiguing, is that a lifter, after a really, really hard week of training that we pushed, comes back the following week with some technique regression because they start compensating subconsciously to basically work away from that fatigue in some way. Let's say their quads are really fatigued. They're going to some way compensate completely inadvertently to being more posterior chain dominant in a squat. Whatever it may be. That's just an example. And so as a coach, our goal is to give them the best possibility to self-align that technique. Regarding the programming, regarding skill practices, all we program is sets of 8, and they're really bad at rep 1. How does that give them any possibility to self-align their technique on the rep that really matters? We're only giving them sets of 8, and if you give them 3 sets of 8, they had 3 chances that workout to be able to actually practice technique that mattered. Not saying sets of 8 are bad, but I'm saying if the issue is rep 1, why give them sets of 8 when they can only practice 3 times on that actual rep that matters? Just a lot of things there where, like, as a coach, way too often we give the athlete something and tell them go fix your technique versus doing everything in our control as a coach to give the lifter the ability to self-align technique without having to overthink, like giving the opportunity, as much opportunity as possible to be able to do that. And that goes back to movement constraints as well. I'm a big fan of movement constraints, of doing things that are just going to put them in the positions I want to. Pause deadlifts are a really, really good one in helping them manage position off the floor and creating patience in that initial setup and wedging position. I love pause squats. That usually helps to kind of control descent so people aren't dive bombing. They learn to decelerate better. That helps them manage center of mass because if you're forward or back when you pause, it doesn't feel good. I love tempo bench. Really helps to create consistency on leg drive because if you let off leg drive while you're tempoing, it doesn't feel good. Also allows them to manage their center of mass and elbow position of the bar. So a lot of things that, like, I need to give my athlete as much ability to display the things I want as possible versus, again, like, here's the program, do it, and then I'm going to give you a cue and you need to go fix your technique, yet I'm giving you very little ability within that to be able to do so.
No, you said something there that I have kind of, in the length of time I've been coaching, you try and mitigate that inter and intra-set fatigue where you might have a higher number of sets. You might have the same total number of reps. So, for example, like if you've 3x6, you could flip that into a 6x3, and then all of a sudden, like you said, where by the time they get to that 8 rep, concentration might slip, they might be a little bit more fatigued, whereas if you have more sets, you spread that workload out more. You see that kind of technique, the technique drop off much less, I find, anyway, because of the less fatiguing sets would be.
Yep. And also not even, so I'm not going to say fatigue isn't real, but a lot of times lifters struggle more with psychology or like mental fatigue than they do in actual physical fatigue intra-workout. And what I mean by that is you do a heavy top set, and then your next set feels like it's 2 RPE higher even though it's a 12% back off. And you know it's not. They just have a big adrenaline and mental dump. And so, like, as a coach, I'm going to program this so psychologically this lifter can best perform. So like I made a video about this recently. Is a great way to be able to kind of manage that is do a top set and then do reascending back off sets. Because we know that first set after their back off, they're going to probably have the biggest adrenaline dump. Let them go lighter. Let them kind of like allow that like initial one to be like kind of, okay, let's get a little bit lighter and then rebuild back up to kind of like almost another top set that's in sense of back off, because it creates this ability for them to kind of reset and refocus, as well as because they know that they're going to work back up to another heavy set, they then kind of re-mentally kind of engage themselves versus if you do a top set and then you do 3 back off sets, let's say, and that first set feels like crap, they automatically assume all the rest of the sets feel like crap, and they've already kind of like I don't know the right word. It's not self-diagnosed, but they've already decided all 3 sets are going to suck.
Yeah.
So there's so many ways on the psychological realm we can change programming to align with how the lifter actually executes the program, because that's an incredibly underappreciated aspect of programming. Is you can have the greatest program in the world on paper, but psychologically, if it does not match the execution of how the lifter performs, it's not going to work. So you have to tailor your programming method to psychologically how the lifter is. And I don't believe, I mean, you can to an extent say, oh, the lifter needs to change how they approach things, but that's not always the case. Like people are like, just like I'm an introvert and some people are extroverts. Don't tell me to be an introvert and go to a party where I don't know anyone and talk to everyone. It's probably not going to happen. My wife, on the other hand, drop her off at a party where she knows no one and she's going to be best friends and probably like have like brunch with them the next day with the whole thing, because that's just her. Like, we're different. And tell her not to talk, and she's literally going to feel like completely like odd. Like it's gonna drive her crazy not to talk. Same thing goes with the execution in powerlifting. People are different in how they approach things. Like, I don't think you should overly tell someone they should go away from like where they comparatively like to bias to. I'd rather leverage that. If they're a really, really hype adrenaline lifter, let's take advantage of the fact that they're a really hype adrenaline lifter. Let's really prioritize peak intensity top sets and find ways to be able to manage that back off work so that they don't have too much of a psychological drop off. If they're a really, really calm lifter, maybe they can handle straight sets. And if you just give them a top set, you're not going to see a great performance increase. So I think you really, as a coach, need to understand kind of you need to, as much as possible, write the program to help the lifter get the intended execution, and that's going to differ from lifter to lifter.
One of the interesting kind of methods I'm currently, or my coach has me experimenting with, is using like rep drops. So working up to like a top set at like 5, and then my next few sets, just keeping loading the bar the same, then dropping down to 4 reps. Whereas like the previous block was ascending sets with back offs. And again, as you said there, like I've definitely noticed in myself over the years, when I do a top set, I just switch off for back offs. As you said, could drop below by about 10%, and it would still feel as hard as the top set because of mentally switched off, right? But those back off sets are still attributing towards like the overall volume of the program, which, if you're leading the competition, can help with like your taper towards the end, or it could just be contributing towards like hypertrophy, right? So if you just kind of see the load exposure as like the only thing that's contributing towards your progress, you could be missing out on a huge area of progression, right? Whereas like with the method I'm using now, because I don't really have the ability to switch off with that top set, and I really have to keep focused, because if I'm keeping the weight and bar the same, just dropping a rep, it's still going to be pretty challenging. The weight hasn't changed at all. I still have to really focus, focus on like my technique. So, again, it's trying to experiment with these different approaches and see what kind of, again, as you said, fits your psychology.
Yep. Another one I did recently, and I cringe at myself for naming it, but frankly, at a certain point, sometimes you do. It's all marketing, but fatigue singles. Did you guys watch my stuff on that? I've had plenty of people make fun of that, and now it's me. Like, I've had people memeing the fact. Whatever. I'll take the brunt. I know exactly what I did. I remember the first time someone got annoyed that I called it that. I was kind of ranting in a chat, and then I stopped myself. I was like, I did this to myself. I know exactly what I did here. But guess what? Anytime someone says fatigue singles from now on, even though I didn't invent this, they think of me. Okay, I'll take it. But either way, the whole reasoning for that was the fact that like lifters do not do well with descending in weight, even though the next set is going to be harder. So if they do a 6 RPE single and then a 7 RPE set of 4, they do not do well with the weight dropping. As soon as the weight drops, they mentally start checking out. And so I found way too often, just like within what I was doing, I was like, anytime I program singles, all of the rep work just tanks. And so all I did, and frankly, a single at 6 to 7 RPE is one of the easiest things we can do. That is not fatiguing at all. That is a very simple. Now, you want to get to like 9, 10, maybe it's a little bit more fatiguing. I would still argue probably more mentally fatiguing, maybe not so on deadlift. But either way, once I started flipping that and I had them do the single afterwards, the entire performance of the session and the average workload and intensity went way up. And it was just simply by an organizational change to the exact same workout. And it had nothing to do with physical fatigue. It had everything to do with the mental approach and the psychology of it. And I just found so much more consistency when implementing singles when I did something like that. And then obviously in the video I did on that, I said there's a lot of different ways you can do it. I have some people that literally will always do the single after. I have some people that just the final week of a block we switch it. Some people it's just the final peaking block we switch it. It just depends. But there's so much. We're getting away from technique. But again, I mentioned to you guys before. I'm gonna go in a lot of random directions, and that's just what I'm gonna do because I talk. But yeah, there was so much about the psychology of it. But like I said, it comes back down to technique as well. There's so much with the psychology and kind of the organization, the intended execution of training that also dictates lifters' technique. If you don't set them up to do it, you can't expect their technique to improve. If you want them to be better at competition squatting and you're constantly giving them cambered bar, pause squats, and safety bar box squats, and you want them to be better at low bar squatting, probably not going to be better at low bar squatting. You're not giving them any ability to do so. Like you got to give the lifter the ability to self-align their technique. And I keep using the word self-align. That is not something I probably used 2 years ago. That's probably a big shift I've had in technique. Is my goal is help the lifter to self-align, because the more they can be able to find ways and change their technique in the sense of me giving them the ability to, the better it's going to be. Because all these cues are cool, but the more the lifter can like create their own internal cues and figure it out on their own, the better it tends to be, and the more they can kind of rely and come back on it versus me always relying on me to fix it and me to look at their video and tell them what to do versus them being able to say, I know exactly what I did wrong because this is how it should feel, and I know this is how it should feel because I was given the opportunity to find that ability to find those positions.
No, I would totally agree with you. I suppose if we look at our motor control or biomechanics and we think of the dynamic systems theory where, or if we went to a more constraints-led approach, like you said earlier, where you might have tempos and pauses and double pauses. And like you said, over time, the lifter will develop their own cues. They will develop their own internal sensations to say, when I'm kind of thinking maybe me with my own clients, but where you might say to someone, look, this is maybe what we're looking for, but over time building their technique or their best technique it's a process. And I think as coaches we want to be able to help the person as quickly as possible, and we cue and maybe we over cue because we want the quick fix, we want this moving now, we want loads of leg drive off the floor, we want your whatever. But I think for that person to develop the skill of the bench press or the skill of the squat, there is so much to be said for that, qualitatively being able to feel what a good squat feels like for them rather than you standing beside them, and that kind of that cue ringing back in their head, because then it kind of removes that ability, like you said, for them to develop their own learning experience to what a good squat or a good deadlift or a good bench feels like.
Yeah. And where that thought came from for me is I saw a lot of coaches being really successful and having lifters being really successful who that we all knew basically gave no technical feedback. And some of them even open that they don't give technical feedback. And rather than saying those coaches suck, I was like, what can I learn from this? How are their lifters being so successful with no technical feedback? And sometimes their lifters wanting to leave because they're like, oh, I want a coach who gives me more technical feedback. And meanwhile, I am sitting here giving tons of technical feedback, having people constantly thinking their technique sucks and overthinking it, and I feel like I'm doing something wrong. So what's the give here? And basically that's where it came from. I was like, these lifters are having to self-align their technique, not overthinking it. So there's something here that I need to meet halfway. Yes, I need to give technical feedback, but there's something to not overly cueing and overly like critiquing your lifter's technique, allowing them to self-align, that worked almost just as well as me over critiquing their technique. And so that's where it was like, okay, like how can I find a happy medium here where I can give them technical feedback, give them the best tools, but also allow them to self-align so that they don't become the habitual overthinkers that every single set they're trying to like be perfect on everything. Like that's the detriment of strength, is trying to do that. So and that's where I really felt like I had a big kind of like breakthrough in like coaching technique, is understanding like when to intervene and when to allow them to self-align, and how to create the opportunities for them to self-align.
Yeah, and I think that comes with experience and comes with time and a little bit of self-confidence. Like, I mean, you'd be, even depending on if you're like, I'm lucky that I can meet a lot of my clients. I suppose I'm lucky and unlucky, because I'd be in the middle of a session. There's a 17-year-old standing there with a video of their top session. You're not even finished yours. But anyway, I'm lucky that I get to coach in person a lot, and you do really have to exercise a lot of kind of constraint in yourself to not over cue and not have the lifter so focused on technique that every time there's a bad set that it can nearly become a fallback. Oh, well, I extended my knees very early on that one, or I did X or Y or Z, and it becomes nearly expected from the lifter then that if something else could be the issue, but its technique becomes the fallback all the time. And that's kind of, I suppose, like you said, going back to the kind of mental approach to the sets, that can be even more so important even more so than technique.
Yeah. And you said something there, it does just come with experience. It comes with, I mean, one thing that was, I think, paramount to my success on online coaching is that I worked with a wide array of people for 10 years in person. I still work with someone who's 74 years old. I worked with 70-year-olds who could barely sit down and stand up. I worked with 18-year-olds who were athletes. Whole wide array of teaching them how to squat, bench, and deadlift in some manner. Now, in general population, it might have been a goblet squat, a trap bar deadlift, and dumbbell bench press. It didn't have to be squat, bench, deadlift as we think it. But it gave a lot of tools, and then continuing as I coach, it gives a lot of tools. Like, for instance, talking about constraining and not overcuing the lifter. I had a lifter this past week who tends to be a chronic overthinker, and her deadlift just was completely off. And I could very much see it was foot pressure. Every set was different in her foot pressure and her setup. I literally told her next session, I just want you to take your shoes off. That's all I want you to do. And she's like, and she probably kind of wanted me to cue her and critique her a bit more. I was like, no, just take your shoes off. Because if you take your shoes off, you're not going to be able to do what you're doing. She took her shoes off, and it felt amazing all of a sudden. Because she couldn't get too far on her heels, she couldn't get too far on her toes, because you all of a sudden feel that bone on bone or bony contact point into the floor, and you don't like it, so all of a sudden you go to your midfoot. There's just a lot of things that over time you gain experience in your toolbox that you can be able to relate from different lifters and know, like, what is the single most simplest way I can fix this lifter's technique without having them to really do much at all.
Very similar experience that my PhD is on, and older adults over 60s and resistance training. So similarly to you, I think an awful lot of the skills that I picked up there with that kind of older group were far more transferable to powerlifters than I expected. And in the same way, I suppose, when you're coaching that older population, and similarly, I suppose, we don't really think of it with powerlifters, but we're much more aware of the cognitive load on cues and technique when it comes to older adults. But in powerlifters, you could have a coach maybe barking 6, 7, 8 cues at someone in the middle of a set, and we don't think about it that way.
Yeah. I think most coaches should treat powerlifters more like general population in-person clients than they should powerlifters. Because, like, if you had a 40-something-year-old gin pop who's never lifted, you wouldn't put them under a barbell, tell them to drive their knees forward, and then let their chest lean. They'd have no idea what you're talking about because they literally have no context of movement at all. What you do, if they're capable, is I give them a front-loaded light weight and put a box behind them and say, I just want you to sit down in the box and stand up. I give them the proper exercise constraint and all the elements to be able to allow them to do what I want them to do. And then once they can manage that position, we can then progress it. But I'm not going to cue them under a barbell. I'm going to find the movement constraint and the movement option that literally allows me to do absolutely nothing, then allow them just to like do something super, super simple. And that, I mean, that's literally gym pop training in a nutshell. Is gym pop training is not about like some special program and periodization. It's literally exercise selection to allow them to perform movements at their current level and learn how to move within certain planes of motion.
Absolutely. Shane, what were you going to say there?
I was going to say in regards to like the self-alignment or like self-organization with clients, I suppose that's a very important part of like coaching, powerlifting, or just online coaching in general, because like we can't be there with the client when they're doing the sessions. Like I know some coaches will, they'll allow their lifters to send them videos like during the session and respond in that moment. But again, it's probably not like the most helpful for the client to become self-aware, right? Because like over time, you do want to have the lifter increase in autonomy and be able to make those decisions. Should I go up in weight if I am like 1 RP below the target? Should I? What adjustment should I make to my technique? What was wrong about that set? Sometimes we can interject, but we could pick out something that wasn't actually what the client thought it was, and then we could actually make another area of an issue for that client, right? So like we kind of want to give them that little bit of space to kind of think through themselves, like, well, what's good about my reps when they're feeding, when the weight's moving well? What is off when they're not moving well, right? And just giving that little bit of time can help them to, again, self-align their technique, because probably over time what you want to be doing as a coach is fostering that autonomy, but being essentially more so the kind of navigator towards their programming and guiding them like towards the kind of the bigger totals, the better squat, the better bench, better deadlift, as opposed to being the person who's always kind of like coming in with these really specific cues or methods that might not necessarily be right for the person at the time.
Yeah, as well as I'll throw out one more or another thing here is the fact of like there are times to maybe overly cue. There is very frequently, if I like take on a new lifter and they have a lot of technical things we want to do, I let them know this is the time we're going to do it. We're going to over cue right now. You're probably going to be a bit frustrated, but let's get this out of the way because I want to get you as quickly as possible to a point that I do not need to overly cue you and we can just worry about strength. So there are times, I mean, usually at a certain point after that, like first block with a lifter, it really never has to go back to that because you work those things out. But there are times like you may take a 4 to 5 week period and say, we know that strength is going to have to suffer here because you're going to overthink this, but we're going to work through these issues. And as well as understanding, I think this is something I definitely struggle with too, is that you give some people something to work on, it doesn't immediately click, and then you immediately give them more to work on because that didn't work. Versus saying, okay, I see some things you did well here. Let's continue to let you like work and self-align this and just let it kind of play itself out because I see a very slight improvement. You just need more time to practice this versus a lot of times people like immediately snap into this thing of like, oh, it didn't work the first time I gave it to you. Let's try something new. It's you got to allow time to kind of let it to kind of like set in and work itself in. And so, yeah, it's very often that like possibly that first block, I'm going to kind of over cue some stuff because we have some things that we really need to work on. If that's the case, some people we don't need to. I'm actually going to skip ahead. I'm kind of stealing your thunder by just taking your questions that you already have, but that's kind of, I like that with the podcast rather than like interviewing, we just kind of talk and whatnot. But you guys, I know, wanted to touch on like helping advanced lifters improve technique. I still laugh how many people like think that like they see some advanced lifter with technique that doesn't look like they want it to be, like they think that it should, and they say that needs to be fixed. They got there for a reason. Like they're at that point for a reason, not in spite of it. Or there's so many, like, so it's so often because I coach, I get a lot of elite level people now that come to me after being elite. And it's the smallest things that we're going to try and fix because usually what got them to this point for a reason. It's very, very, very rare I get an elite level lifter that we need to like change everything. If we do, it's because they were just so genetically freakish that they were able to get so strong without any idea. Like, actually, honestly, I didn't coach Bob, but Bob is a good example of that. Like, Bob was just so freakishly strong, and I don't really think he had much background in much, and then he came to Marcellus, and then you combine some technical improvement with everything else, and Bob just goes crazy. But I get Natalie Richards coming to me, It was just super, 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 super small, slight little things that we made changes to that made a good difference. And then from there, I literally put in my notes, don't screw them up. You can easily screw them up more than you can help them most of the time in trying to overly change what they're doing, considering that likely what got them there is what they need to keep doing for a reason, even if it looks weird to some others. So,
I think as coaches, go on ahead there, Steve. I just think as coaches we have I don't know, is it because we're aware we're being paid and we're aware that we want to make a difference and we want to do good, but I think sometimes the intervention, and you said something there earlier, I can't remember quite what it was, but this thought kind of came into my head, and as you're saying it there, it's kind of resonating a bit more with me, but we kind of intervene a lot of the time out of feeling compelled to, or that we sometimes have to say something or we have to do something. And I see it all the time with coaches that we kind of maybe change something for the sake of it, as opposed to saying, okay, look, we'll let you marinate in this for a week or two, or like it was the cue, you were saying, okay, let's try this cue, didn't work amazing initially, let's just change the cue entirely, rather than sticking with the cue maybe for 3, 4, 5 sessions, a couple of weeks, and then maybe changing it. But I think as coaches, a lot of the time we just kind of have to step back and, like you said, let the lifter self-align, as opposed to constantly pushing what we want and our own biases and our own kind of our own insecurities on the lifter.
Yep. And you said insecurities. I was going to say lack of confidence, because that 100%. Yeah. I did that. Like, lack of confidence, you get a lifter and you feel like you don't provide enough. I can't think of the word for it. Not quality, value. You do not provide enough value as a coach unless you give them all these cool things that they need to change. Versus now having the confidence where I'm at to say, no, like, you want me to change everything, and I'm telling you we're not changing a single thing. And I am confident to say that. And like, when I say that, at this point, I don't even think it's necessarily because of like me having the track record I do. I think it's how I display it. I can very confidently tell them, no, I actually don't think we need to overly think this. Your bench looks really good. Let's not screw this up. I think your issue is you've actually been overthinking and thinking you need to change too much versus just being confident and lifting the weight right now. And so that is just as important of a tool as a coach to teach technique, to tell lifters don't change anything, as it is to actually change something and have the confidence to do so. But a lot of times with these advanced, this is any lifter, but I'll use advanced lifters for an extent, is a lot of times I'm gonna create constraints to make sure we just don't regress, because that is one of the most frustrating things as a coach, is we've all had it. The lifter just forgets how to lift out of nowhere. Everything's so good and they just forget how to lift. And that could be for a multitude of reasons, but I have a lot of people that, like, we have some kind of constraints within the program at all times to keep that. Like, I have multiple people that will always pause deadlift, and I've tried to take them out. And I take them out, and immediately by the end of the block, we see technical regression. And then I learn, okay, those just always need to stay in. As long as I keep pause deadlifts in, as long as I keep tempo bench on this day, whatever it may be. Demetria Thoughton, who I've coached for a while now, I've tried so many times to not have her primary day be pause squats. Every time I take it away, her squat technique regresses. So, just in perpetuity. Her primary day is pause squats, and her primary deadlift day is pause deadlifts other than her single. She always has a single that's regular comp deadlift. And I use the pause deadlifts to actually build up to the single, like a fatigue single, as a way to constrain and allow them to self-align technique. So when she does that comp single, it's feeling great by them. So it's just always in there, because if I take it out, it regresses. The other thing, a lot of times I have things people do, is, especially when they start to self-align and they get confidence in what they're doing, is I will have them take notes and actually have it in the Google sheet of, this is the things I'm thinking of with squatting, so that when it regresses, I can say, hey, go back to that. I don't know what necessarily you were, because I can't keep track of what 25 people are thinking. I only coach 25 people. If I wasn't in my certain situation, I might be coaching 50 people like most do. I can't keep track of all 50 people's internal cueing on every single lift. I can have an idea, but if any coach says they know every single thing every one of their lifters is thinking on all 3 lifts, I think they're lying. That's cap. So I have them write that in a Google Sheet sometimes and say, okay, I want you to write this so that if technique regresses, I can go click on this video from a year and a half ago when your deadlift looked the best, send it to you and say, okay, this is when it was looking the best. These are your notes from that time. self-align back to this. Start kind of thinking and kind of looking at this again versus me having to overly cue, because I might start cueing them in a different way than I did before and completely read them down the long path. Because that's another thing. I mean, as a coach, we're not going to be perfect. I might forget the cueing that got them to that point to an extent. I might remember to an extent, but maybe there's a very step-by-step process that needs to get there. I might forget that. And so that's why I somehow have them take notes. So one thing I just thought about that I had very detailed notes in my notes about that I forgot to mention, a big shift I've had recently in technique, and I think it's probably the biggest thing this year I've changed and what do I address, is I've always thought setup is important. I've now kind of shifted to setup is everything. Like, if you set up correctly and everything is set up correctly on all three lifts, the lift is kind of should be mindless. And so I if you look at a lot of my content recently, it's been a lot about setting up, because I've just kind of had this shift to where, like, if I just get them to set up properly on squat, bench, and deadlift in the initial setup, everything aligns there. The lift is just like a spring-loaded band. It's just pull it, return,
release,
boom, we do the lift. Like that's it. And it's good, because the time to overthink, if there is a time to overly cue maybe, is during the setup, because we're not lifting. Like there's one or two things we think about unracking the squat. There's something we think about when we walk it out. There's something we think about when we are bracing. We might have 5 or 6 cueing there, but then once we are in that position, drop, stand up. That's all we got to do. Like if we align that setup really well and we take our time there, we got 60 seconds to do it. If we take our time there, it pretty much loads the movement to where you don't have to cue during the movement very much. It becomes very, very simple.
Yeah, that's like, probably new clients probably think I'm a little bit too I'm a bit too picky about their squat walkouts when they send it to me initially, because like their actual pattern could be really good, like even controlling the bar pad could be really good, but it's just the setup. You know, they're unracking with like 1 foot underneath the bar, and, you know, not really kind of creating any like upper back tightness, and you spend maybe like 5 or 10 minutes going through, okay, this is what we need to do, and like they come back to you next week and like, it's drastically improved. I can lift way more weight. But it is one of those things that, like, the setup with the likes of all of the lifts, they're putting you in the strongest position in regards to, like, with the squat, like, you're getting it over the strongest part of your spine, over the strongest part of your mid foot, you know, creating that nice shelf on your upper back. Similar with the bench, like, you know, getting it over either chest or over the shoulders. And like the deadlift, like, I mean, if there's ever a lift where you need to kind of really nail the setup, is like the deadlift, because you don't have the eccentric to like self-correct if you do fuck up. So being a little bit too picky with it is like absolutely essential.
Yep. Once you unrack the bar, you can't change your upper back position. You can never do it again. That's the only time you can be able to like adjust your upper back position. Once you unrack the bar on bench press, you can't change your grip. It's done. It's set. Once you grab the bar on deadlift, you can't change your hinge and angle and pelvic orientation and low back. Like, you're kind of done. Like, you maybe can kind of self-correct it to an extent as you wedge in, but like it's nailing those things and being patient on each step and segmenting it. Like, I'm big on deadlift. Every portion of that setup in deadlift is segmented. It's not one motion. Every portion of the bench is we're setting our grip. Then we're wedging under. Then we're lock out our elbows. Then we unrack. Then we slowly set our hips down. It sounds like a lot, but once you nail that setup, and that's the time to overthink it, because you can take 30, 40 seconds to do it, the lift becomes very mindless for people, versus I think a lot of people who tend to need to over-cue are the people that don't set up properly, and then all they're doing during their lift is trying to compensate and fix what they screwed up in their setup.
I think I would actually use quite a similar, I suppose we can call these cues, but or not cues, or we can call it setup, but I suppose we are cueing a setup in a way. But what I would always say to people is we kind of nearly want to create a checklist where you're going, hands in the bar, feet underneath the bar, hips underneath the bar, extend your knees, step, position. After that, then it's just like you say, it's just getting in the right headspace. But where I think I would really, really agree with you is, especially in powerlifting, where we want as little variance as possible across sets, reps, that if we can have really, really consistent setups and kind of hammering home that checklist or that setup to the point where it becomes autonomous almost. And that's where I suppose what this whole conversation is about, is we're trying to get the the person from that early stage of skill acquisition where they have to think about it, and the motor pattern is quite mechanical to the point where we can get them to where, like you said earlier, they can just focus on completing lift and putting all their effort into it rather than going, okay, knees forwards, hips back, brace, back tight, head up, chin tucked back, and it's impossible. Like it's a point of I suppose there's a ceiling on and the floor, to where cues and kind of technique alterations can bring someone.
Yeah, and I like your point of like limiting variance, because I would argue that most variance comes from the initial starting position, not what they're doing as they're actually going through the lift. It's the initial starting position is where the variance is, and then that variance creates the variance during the lift. So if we just nail the setup in the initial starting position on everything, we reduce that variance versus, like I said, like if you don't nail the initial setup, all you're doing throughout that lift is having to compensate to fix the initial setup. By like, for instance, like on deadlift, how many people don't have any hinge, they round over, and then they go to wedge, and the entirety of their wedge is trying to re-extend the back to get maybe a little bit more neutral. When like why do we need like, and then every lift they do, the variance of where they get their back position changes, which then changes their center, it changes everything. Like if you just stop the variance before you ever touch the bar in the first place, like you wouldn't have that issue. So yeah, I think that's something I've been big about. It goes to simplification. It's way easier to teach someone the setup and making that consistent than it is to try and hopefully figure out how to make the actual lift consistent when the setup isn't in the first place. And so it's all about finding what is the thing we can do that kills the most birds with one stone. Like what gives us our most bang for the buck.
Yeah,
and usually it's way simpler than people will think it'll be. So yeah, I mean, I'll use like an example. We'll talk elite lifters. She did a video on it, but when I first started coaching Natalie Richards, her squat wasn't bad. She had a little bit of an issue with depth consistently, and then she had consistent hip pain. And part of that was I felt like her workload was just too high in general, but the second thing, she was looking up at the ceiling whenever she would squat. And so immediately when she squats, her rib cage just flares up. She would hit the bottom of the squat, not have the range of motion she needs with that interior kind of like femur position to the hip. She'd get that pincing sensation, she'd come up. Literally all I had her do was look down a little bit, and that's all I had her do. That's all. And one little setup change, just look down a little bit and completely changed everything. She started going deeper, she had no hip pain, and it's been done. Like it was just a setup position with the alignment of where we're trying to fix things, and it was able to fix it was able to fix center of mass, it was able to fix depth, and it was able to fix hip pain in one simple head alignment situation.
Yeah,
less is more.
Yeah, I think people don't realize the kind of minute changes you can get with even just something like fixing your eye gaze. Like the kind of typical thing here in powerlifting is like where your eye gaze is, like your body will follow, but like that does not necessarily mean you have to be like staring at the ceiling if you want the bar to go up, right? Just it's about the eye gaze, not necessarily the head position extended back. And sometimes what is happening at the kind of cervical spine is going to impact what's happening at the lumbar as you hit depth, like in the squat, because too much kind of upper back extension kind of limit the limit of the amount of kind of hip flexion you're going to get to at the bottom of the squat, right? That's going to limit depth. Again, might not necessarily meet the minimum requirement of powerlifting standard. Hit depth.
Yep. Another example too. Again, it's you gotta. This it comes from experience too. Is you got to find the root cause. You're not always addressing the issue. You got to address what is eventually leading to the issue. And like for example, I did a video on setting up during the unrack on squat. I can tell you how many people during that initial unrack they set up with their chest down, they push their hips under, they unrack, they got this overly depressed rib cage. They walk it out, and then the first thing they do is they shove the rib cage up to counter that because they can't actually squat with this depression. Then at the bottom, they can't stay with that extended rib cage because they can't hit depth. So then they shift forward, and you say, "Oh, we need to manage center of mass better." No, it all led back to the initial unrack. Like if you fix that, it literally fixes everything else to the entirety of the squat, which is easier said than done. Not everyone's going to be the same situation, but like it's a lot of times of like you gotta identify the issue, but figure out what was the initial thing that caused it, and again allow the lifter to be able, like I can't cue the lifter to fix that unless I allow them the ability to set up better and give them the ability to set up properly to then implement what I want them to do on the actual lift. So
where I suppose, Steve, would you kind of draw the line between constraints and the need to implement competition work? So you kind of said there's a lady you're coaching where you have to have, you're in a peak, and the need to kind of have more competition work in there will obviously increase, but where do you kind of draw the line, or what will inform your decision to have more or less competition work in outside of the actual
So, I
necessity
mean,
to?
almost always, if I have a situation like that, they're still doing the competition work at all times. Like for Demetria, for instance, she competition squats on her tertiary and her primary or secondary day, so she still does it. There's something I've tried doing pause squats on the other day. I've tried just doing them on her tertiary day, and you think, oh, as long as she has that constraint on her tertiary day, she's fine. She can do. Nope, doesn't work. It has to be the heaviest day. Something about the heaviest day being pause squats. So she does competition squatting on all the other days, and then when we get to a peak and we're trying to implement singles, all we're doing is implementing a competition single on the same day along with the pause work. Same thing, I have some other people, like they'll do competition deadlift on their secondary day, they'll do pause deadlifts on their primary day, and all we'll do is once we start introducing singles, that will be a regular competition single versus the pause deadlifts they're doing on the day. So Sean Noriega actually just did a really good video on this on variation on Powerlifting Now, because it was the discussion like, how long do you use these, or do you always use them? Because my goal typically would be, can I take them out? I mean, most people, I will want to eventually take them out. After it fixes the issue, I want to remove them to give them more practice. But you are going to find lifters that they just have to stay in. And I think some coaches are scared to always leave that in, saying, oh, they need to do, like, that doesn't make sense. They can't just pause squat on their primary day all the way through the competition. Well, if it works throughout the entirety of the year and they get stronger, like, why would I change that in competition? And knowing that anytime I take it out, their technique regresses and the competition squat gets worse. So that's going to be more a minority of lifters that are going to need to always keep something like that in. But there are some. You're going to have some people that legitimately you're just literally going to always leave that in, because if you take it out, they regress. And so the argument there is like it is making their competition lift better, so you don't need more competition practice. You literally need that because that's what makes the competition lift better.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an interesting one there, Reese.
Go on,
January. No, I just said I think it's an interesting point that you said that on the heavier loading day that you have to keep in, or you have to keep the pause squat in on the heavier loading day. I suppose it kind of is a testament to that. I suppose the constraint of the pause squat, that it is obviously teaching the lifter something that a normal competition squat, if you had a pause squat versus a pause squat double at an 8 versus a comp squat double at an 8, there is obviously something really, really important internally happening for that lifter that you just can't replicate on the comp squat. And I think that's where, in my own programming with my own clients, that if I am programming variations, I would try and keep them on a secondary or a primary day, because I think what you said there, that in your own experience as a coach, I kind of see a lot of as well, that when the load isn't high enough, and I don't know, is it a concentration thing or something, but when the load isn't high enough or the intensity of the lift isn't high enough, and the lifter can kind of check out a little bit and maybe not be as concentrated, and the constraint of the movement is kind of almost lost, and it doesn't have as big a crossover then to their heavier competition work then as I would like. So I was kind of the opinion that, okay, look, if we have our tertiary deadlift day or tertiary bench day or whatever, we have a long pause or we have a tempo or something there, that should be fine, similar to what you said. But kind of the longer I'm seeing. Go ahead.
So the spectrum I see there is the more advanced, the heavier the variation work would need to be. The more they're beginners, the lighter it could be and they get benefit. Because beginners are literally just learning how to move. Advanced lifters, they know how to squat, bench, and deadlift. That's not an issue. So likely they're gonna get more carryover when that variation is on a heavier day, because they don't need to be taught how to squat. There's something about that translates because of the heavier exposure to it. Versus I do think beginners can get away with it being lighter because they just simply are being taught proper form in the first place. And then kind of backtracking too, in the sense of like, yes, sometimes you have to always leave it in. I mean, my goal most of the time would be to periodize it out. And I say periodize it out because the mistake some people make is they'll do some variation. It works really well in helping constrain the lifter, and then they just completely pull it. versus maybe it's on the primary day. Then it moves to the secondary day. Then you leave it as just a secondary day top set, or maybe you leave it for back downs on the secondary day or something, and you slowly periodize it out. And maybe you find a point that you're like, oh, I can get to the point where these pause squats can just be the back off sets on a secondary day, and it's enough to be able to keep it there. Now, if I pull it, it regresses too much, but I periodize it to the point where I find this limit of how can I get enough specificity but still maintain that practice and that constraint that I'm needing, or do I even need it? Maybe I eventually slowly let it come all the way out, and I realize I don't need it anymore. But I think the issue too many people have, this dates back to kind of a conjugate style, is you just kind of throw these random variations and you pull them back, and they give a lot of benefit, and then you take them out, and you're like, and then all of a sudden things change, and you're like, there was something to the fact that it was there in the first place. Let's slowly periodize the programming of it, to see where that spectrum is of they need it. Do they need it at all? Or can we have it just like on a very, very easy back offset day in some manner? So
I suppose maybe, and I don't know if this is maybe a curveball at you there. It's maybe a conversation I had with someone a couple of weeks ago, but what are your considerations maybe for programming a tempo versus a pause? So in what situations would you see a tempo being more needed than maybe a pause, or vice versa?
So it depends on the lift. I definitely bias towards pauses on deadlift. I don't really do tempos because I'm pretty against. I read a post about this. I'm pretty against tempoing the concentric of a deadlift, even though that was apparently a fad recently. I didn't even know it was. Apparently that was a fad, like a tempo to a knee deadlift. Yeah, I'm not. Yeah. I think there's better ways we can go about that. So on squat, I do bias towards a pause for the reason that I think tempo tends to change the eccentric speed too much for someone, to where when they actually go back to their competition squat, it's a bit too far removed from what they actually do. And frankly, a pause does tend to make people slow down, for the reason that when you know you have to decelerate and stop, you're going to decelerate sooner. Versus when you don't feel like it's stopped, you're going to allow yourself to be able to go down a bit faster. So I usually bias towards pauses there in that manner. On bench, I go the opposite. I tend to like tempo for the reason of leg drive. And that's something I tend to keep in a lot of times. And frankly, I think a lot of times, more so on bench, I think most people could tempo their bench and hit the same weight that they could do on the regular RM. I don't for one rep. Now, tempo on any lift has a big diminishing effect rep to rep. Like what you can tempo for a set of 5 versus a set of 1 based on like ERM, what E1RM is significantly different just because of that time under tension. But for that singular rep, especially for bench press, I think most people, especially if you're maybe like a higher arch bencher, wider grip, the kind of like the thing we see in powerlifting a lot of times nowadays, even moderate arch, whatever, you could probably about tempo what you could actually normally bench press. And so I don't find the deviation there too much. And so that's something I tend to leave in pretty consistently, because a lot of people just doing like one tempo set a week or one tempo single can like do everything they need to kind of manage leg drive and kind of constrain that and make sure it stays there. So yeah, I'm trying to kind of think. I really haven't programmed tempo squats in a while. I think that would likely be something maybe I'm going to do a bit more for a beginner, and frankly, I just don't coach many beginners now. That's one thing I've kind of, I almost think about making a video on sometime, is like, if you consume my content and you want to do everything I do and you try and copy it, you have to understand the type of people I coach. I don't coach beginners anymore. If I coached only beginners, I probably have a lot of different content coming out than when I coach. I don't want to say elite level people, because I of the 25 people I coach, maybe 10 are elite. Like I have a lot of other people that are just they're I don't call them average, but they're not winning nationals or winning world titles and whatnot or things like that. But they're experienced. I don't tend to take on beginners because I'm grumpy and I don't like to. I like to take on people who are more well established, and I can be very, very confident that they're going to be a good client and not be troublesome. Yeah. So I coach usually more like experienced, consistent people. They don't have as many life variables, and that gets to be a choice. So you have to understand that's the type of people I'm coaching, and I do get to, in a sense, create optimal programs because of that. Because like I don't have to deal with as many variables. So in a sense, what I do preach on should work with everyone. In reality, if they were consistent. But the fact of the matter is, if you coach only beginner level 17-year-old lifters who are going out and partying and have a girlfriend that they broke up with, you're going to have a very different way that you need to go about coaching them, because they're not going to be consistent. They're not going to have all these things like perfectly aligning so that they're kind of robots that you can experiment and I do X thing and I know exactly if X thing works or not. You have no idea, because when they get drunk and come back on a Monday, I don't know if what we did worked or not. Like, it is what it is. So I kind of lost train of thought because I kind of went on a tangent there. But anytime you're looking at what I'm saying, you have to understand who I'm kind of saying that towards. So what was the original thing we were talking about, so I can wrap that back around the technique? Tempos.
Yeah.
Tempos. I use it more with beginners because there might be a little bit more validity there in them having to just figure out how to control a movement in the first place at all, versus an elite level lifter. I don't necessarily think they tend to have an issue, again, learning a squat or controlling a squat. They're just minor deviations we need to do. So there's a big difference in who I am programming constraints for versus who you might program constraints for a very beginner level lifter. Like, for instance, I've definitely shifted a bit. I love safety bar squats. If safety bar squat could be the competition movement in powerlifting, I'm all for it. I think it's the greatest squat in the world. When I coach general population lifters, they usually don't even touch a barbell. I think safety bar and trap bar is the best thing for general population people because it's just much easier to do. A safety bar, I can put them under there. They're probably going to squat a lot better. We don't have to do barbell squats. I don't find myself doing that as much with the lifters I coach now because of the type of lifter they are, versus when I coached a lot more beginners, I did a lot more safety bar. I still think it's a great movement, but I did a lot more safety bar squatting when I was with beginner level lifters because they just didn't even know how to squat. And so like when I could get them under a safety bar and it just kind of constrained them because of the forward weight bias, it was a lot more beneficial. Now I have differing reasons why I do safety bar squats. So you have to understand that like there's the spectrum here of the whys. Like tempo squats for an elite level or like an experienced lifter is very different for why you might program it for a beginner lifter. Safety bar for an experienced lifter might be very well different for a beginner lifter. I have lifters that I like. One of the main people I have doing safety bar for on secondary days is because they can't low bar squat twice a week, and even high bar puts them in a position that's somewhat compromising for kind of like shoulder and tricep pain, and so they safety bar squat. That's a very different reason than I have for doing it for a beginner lifter, where I'm doing it because I need them to understand how to like control rib cage position and center of mass, and this allows them to do it in a much easier manner versus low bar squatting, which creates issues because of the natural extension bias it creates. So that's kind of something too, is like as everyone's listening to this, understand like it almost kind of stinks that we don't really have popular coaches who specialize in beginners, because that is a very important content. Maybe that'll be something I kind of limb back towards and kind of start making a little bit. That would be actually a good idea, because we don't really have that. We just have popular coaches who coach mainly at advanced and elite level lifters putting out content, but guess who that works for? They're lifters, not the 17-year-old who's just learning how to lift.
Where I'm coaching out of it at the moment, it's go on, sorry Shane, you go on.
I said myself and Lawrence will take you on if you're listening.
Yeah. But where I'm working at the moment, abs powerlifting here in Ireland, we're having an academy program, and the idea of it is that it's providing kind of a programming and coaching. I suppose it's a very affordable option for that kind of younger demographic that are maybe 15 to 23. But what we're kind of seeing recurringly is that the communication and the style of coaching that you need to have for even like I suppose people that even in your early 20s, unless you've been lifting for a fair amount of years, there is still a newness to the movement. So that's kind of what we're trying to do at the moment. But it's there's
even a thing too. I mean, this isn't as much as like the difference between a mid-20s advanced level lifter versus a 15-year-old beginner lifter. But there's even differences in coaching in different countries. Like there is different like stigmas and like general practices in Ireland than there is in the US, and there is in the Netherlands, and there is in Australia, and there's biases that programming and technique has come from, and you have been exposed to and influenced by than what I was influenced and exposed by. So when I have to teach someone in Germany how to squat, they've been exposed to very different learning techniques possibly than the same exact type of lifter in the US. So there's so many things here that like you have to understand like context of who people are like having experience from and where their tools and their toolbox are coming from, because I have very different, not kickback, I guess is the way, like when I've coached lifters from other countries, like kickback on like how they want to do, like I have a lifter from Europe, they used to squat, bench, and deadlift 5 days a week, all 3 lifts. And like, it was crazy to them that they're not going to do that anymore, because that was what they were exposed to and that's what they did. And like, the thought that you only squat twice a week is insanity to them. I don't have that issue in the U.S. because no one does that. Like, that isn't something I have to deal with there. Or even like, I mean, maybe this is an American elitism, but like, I tend to find, it depends on the country, that sometimes they're about 3 or 4 years behind what we are. I don't know if you guys feel that at all too. You might even see that between different European countries, but like, the things that I see popularized in Australia is what was popular in the U.S. 3 years ago, and like they're kind of tends. I don't know if it's, again, you can yell at me and say I'm an arrogant American, but I feel like to an extent a lot of like the leading theologies are coming from the U.S. to an extent. I think that comes from the popularity of the coaches here to an extent as well, and what it may be. But I do find that. Tell me if I'm an arrogant American and I should shut up. But correct or
I guess
deny that.
Within the zeitgeist of powerlifting, if we kind of think about it's a very trend-based sport. Like if we think about the history of powerlifting, where we had equipped lifting and then kind of a West Side style, conjugate style of periodization, kind of underpinned what absolutely everyone was doing, because who were the best athletes in the world? There were West Side barbell athletes, and who was coaching them? It was Louis Simmons. So everything Louis Simmons said and did was at the forefront. And then when we're kind of in the new age of powerlifting, where everything is raw, and then all of the superstars coming out from that era, the John Hacks, the Ray Williams, Amanda Lawrences, they were again all American, all get coached by American coaches. And I suppose I suppose powerlifting is a very unique sport in the sense that it's an extremely homogenous culture, in the sense that it's I suppose quite American based. And I think even people inadvertently, I just worked in a college here, and one of the last year, one of the French guys that was studying in the college pulled out his phone to me, and we just got chatting about powerlifting. His English was kind of conversational, but as soon as he started powerlifting or talking about powerlifting, his English was immaculate, because all of the media he was consuming from powerlifting was from Americans.
Well, that's a big thing too, because like Emil Krastev, I actually think he has decent amount of subscribers on YouTube, but it's all in Bulgarian. Like, no one except Bulgarians can consume that content, versus I think English is just more widespread. So, and you have a lot of American content creators who are putting out that information. So it just kind of leads to it. Like, it doesn't even mean that we're the best by any means. It just means that like seemingly we are I think also America tends to be more social media dominant. Like, we have to post everything we've ever done in our entire life on social media. Versus how many other countries we don't even know the lifters exist until they get to Worlds. It just tends to be a thing, as well as like the culture too. I've seen this from other countries. Is the culture in the U.S. is you have your online coach, and there's the flex team, and there's Marcellus, and there's game day, and there's PRs, and there's Nori. Versus like a lot of other countries, it's still the head coach of the national team is who coaches all their lifters, and like it's still very much like an intra-country singular thing. Versus like, even going back to the U.S. before the online coaching, is you went to a gym and the gym owner coached everyone, a la West Side and whatnot. And it just depends on where you come from. And even too, like you mentioned West Side, obviously West Side heavily influenced the U.S. It got even outside the U.S. But like when I think of European influence, I think Dietmar Wolf. And honestly, I don't even know that much about him, but he's kind of the person that I think about. Like, I think he influenced a lot of like European training protocols. And that is so different, or Shaco too, so different from Louis. Shaco and Dietmar are like high frequency, high volume. Louis is like, I'm maxing out on Mondays.
Yeah, I suppose maybe that's I think an awful lot of powerlifting at the moment, though, you can see the old Eastern European influence in programs, and you can see the West Side influence. And I think an awful lot of programming in powerlifting, you can see the kind of skeletons in the closet from both sides, that you still have coaches that will lean towards a Smolov style of really, really ramping up volume at a certain time. But similarly, then you'll see coaches follow that I suppose, West Side approach, where, okay, we're going to hit 1 at 9 or 1 at 8, which is basically almost like the old max effort day, where they would just pick a variation and go hammer and tongs at that. But I suppose it's powerlifting is, you said something earlier, it's a funny sport, because for what we know now from kind of a lot of the research in recent years, that there's so many ways to skin the cat, and that really there is an interaction there between the art of programming and the science of periodization, and that's kind of the marrying of the two, when I think about it anyway, that you're almost a painter with a paintbrush, but you're also that kind of like coder as well, sitting there trying to come up with an almost a program. But yeah, that's, sorry, went on a little rant there.
No, good. And it's actually, I mentioned to you guys, we're going to film the Powerlifting Now podcast today. And one of the topics is there really a difference between coach to coach? Because I've had some people say, like, they're like, assuming all services are equal, you're not getting ignored in your not assuming everyone is getting similar, like, baseline level services they should be. The actual ability to program and coach the athlete, is that different? And one, I would argue that there's soft skill differences, but two, it's like you said, like, there's so many different ways to skin the cat. I don't know if, like, just because I program a certain way doesn't mean everyone needs to do it. There's people programming entirely different ways that are seeing success. I think it tends to come, the notes I kind of made, it comes a lot back to, like, how many tools in the toolbox does that coach have to be able to problem solve in the fastest manner possible? And I think that literally is, that's likely the biggest difference coach to coach, is like, how many tools in the toolbox do they have, and how fast can they use those tools to problem solve different athletes. And a lot of things lead to that. A lot of things, like if you coach similar style athletes, we see most coaches a lot of times start to attract similar athletes and have success. And it's for a reason, because they start to get more tools in the toolbox when all they coach is 83 kilo men or 57 kilo women, and you see them start to have a bunch of them, and they all are successful. Well, you know why? It's partially because they're getting a lot of them that are similar, and they're getting it would happen anyways. But two is because they're getting so many tools in their toolbox for that style of lifter that they get to be better and better at coaching that style. Versus if you go give them all of a sudden, if you're really good at coaching a 57 kilo female, now they get a 140 kilo male, your tools are different. They're different tools. Because there is some application that spans across all of powerlifting, but there's also a difference in being able to have that. So I think a lot of it is like, programming does matter, but your tools in your toolbox to problem solve, and how many of those do you have? Do you just simply have a template you write and everyone's getting it? Or are you adjusting based off of lifter psychology and execution? Are you, like, all these things we're talking about right now, how many tools do you have to be able to adjust based off of the lifter, based off of their actual, like, anthropomics and their body, sex, and that kind of thing, their psychology and all that kind of stuff? Like, how are you able to adjust to that and adjust your system to meet them halfway? And anytime I'm putting out content, like, it's funny now because I'm not doing anything different than I used to, but now I'm to the point now where, Steve released a new video, it's become a fad, and like, everyone's going to have to do it, and it's going to last for 6 months, and no, I'm not putting out anything to make it a fad necessarily, albeit, again, yes, I named it fatigue singles, I take full blame for that, but they're all just tools for your toolbox. It's not meant for everyone to do it. I just continually releasing stuff like I've always done. It's just more tools for your toolbox. Like, this works for 3 or 4 lifters you have. You don't apply it to the other ones. They're just all tools. The issue is once you become to a certain popularity, then just everyone's going to do it, and then it comes back to that kind of stuff. And then I even had someone, this one is far-fetched. I think this one is ridiculous, but I had someone saying center of mass is a fad, and that's going to die out. And I'm like, we can't get rid of gravity. Like, I don't think we're ever getting rid of gravity on that one. I can understand the fatigue singles and some of the other stuff. People are doing too much. Weighted dips was a fad that me and Marcellus started. I really don't think gravity is going to go out of popularity. I think that one's going to stay for a little bit.
The three of us would be out of the job fairly quick if gravity was out of the equation. But I think
maybe the colonization of Mars and taking powerlifting there. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe the fad will stop when powerlifting meets will be held on Mars in the eventual colonies.
And we see a 750 kilo deadlift on Mars. That's fair, yeah.
Yeah.
I think you said something very fair though, like, which is things like in powerlifting. This is kind of maybe going back to my earlier point. Things get repackaged, and I think in powerlifting, depending on who the coach is, how up to date they are. Like, I when I started, the first powerlifting gym I was in was West Side based kind of gym, and they were all equipped powerlifters. And what would you do after your max effort squat? Well, you would do speed deadlifts, obviously, and that would look like 10 ones, 5 twos, 6 threes, 7 twos, 7 threes, whatever. What was the idea? We're going to do some low RPE deadlift work, and we're going to get in a little bit of extra volume after a squat. And then you'll see that repackaged now into maybe, okay, we want to mitigate intercept fatigue, all of these different reasons, but in principle and on the program, it's the same thing.
Yeah. And I think this is, I knew this would happen because this is just how I am, but I love the talks because we don't have to have like some set schedule. But like something I think about too is the fact that like I do think my content, I try really, 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 really hard to not do things that are like absolutes. Because even though it's going to get turned into it, even though some people are going to take it out of context and they're going to say, oh, Steve said do this, and then when I do something different, like, well, you said do this, why are you doing it? It's like I'm trying not to be an absolutes. These are all just tools for your toolbox in an infinite number of tools. But I think that's a reason why I think my content's been successful, and a lot of coaches tend to like to take things from me because I think I've done a decent job of not creating absolutes and doing this aspect of like, I'm going to give tools in the toolbox versus conforming to this is the singular system, this is the only way to do it. You do speed deadlifts afterwards, which eventually, if you do that, this is going back to like coaching longevity, if you do that and the fad goes away, your coaching fad goes away. Because I've honestly thought about this. Online coaching's new. You have to continue to do things to stay relevant. Like you can't just like get to a certain point and be like, okay, I'm here, I get to say, like you have to keep doing stuff or else you will, like we see coaches' popularity go up and down. And that's a big thing that I've tried to really do is find ways that, okay, how do I actually do this for a career? Because we don't have very many people other than maybe like Mike Teixeira, Louis, a Dietmar Wolf, who have like made this a 20, 30, 40-year career. I've done this for like 5 years professionally now. Like I plan to hopefully do this for another 25 years. Like how do I do that? And if you create fad stuff too much, when the fads die, you die. Versus I really, really, really try and make sure my content is something that is more tools in the toolbox so that when the fads die out, I don't die out, if that makes sense. This goes back to the fact that, yes, I'm trying to... There's a marketing side to this. I do get to able to come back around to my marketing expertise, is that there's a marketing side, and while I'm not trying to overly be gimmicky and markety, there's an element of like behavioral psychology and consumer behavior of like how am I able to stay relevant and not just be a fad that dies out.
So when we see you start to put up Steve's 5 ways to blow up your deadlift videos, we know the end is near.
It's coming. It's like I said, I jokingly, so I did bench wedge. Well, I shouldn't say I did bench wedging. Bench wedging was Sean, and I got permission to use it because he's not going to make a YouTube video, so I just took bench wedging from him. I didn't make that up. But we've got deadlift wedging, we've got bench wedging, and then I had a bunch of people joking, when are you coming out with the squat wedging? And Matt Cronin basically told me, he's like, if you do a squat wedging video, I'm firing you. So he's like, that's your tipping point, Steve. You're a complete sellout if you do squat wedging. And I joked because that unracking video I did could have been squat wedging. I could have called it that. I could have called it
squat wedging. Yeah.
I could have called it squat wedging, but I was like, there's a limit to my morality here, and I can't cross the line. I've got to remit. That was
could
my
have been
line.
a
I'm not going
t-shirt.
to do it.
You just could have had master the wedge, and that could have been a whole line of clothes for you then afterwards as well. Yeah, you missed both. That's what me and Shane are going to monopolize that squat wedge now after you telling us that.
And I think so. Again, I do that to an extent, but I think I try to be careful because if I do that too much, it diminishes the value of my content to the point that Steve's just a marketing gimmick now. Like you have
100%.
to. And I do all of this. I mean, I do the content creation stuff because I truly just I got into this content stuff. One, because I did feel like it was a path that would allow me to get to where I'm at, which obviously it was. It worked. But two, I've always been really good at the education side. I've always felt like that was just a natural born gift I have, and I felt like that was something I could give back. And I mean, I've had 50-something YouTube videos for free, not because I necessarily, I'm not taking on any more clients. Like, if I make a YouTube video, I'm not necessarily getting anything monetary from that other than like $200 a month in Google AdSense, which I don't care about. I don't get much from that anymore. Like, I legitimately want to educate people, albeit Powerlifting Now obviously is a platform we are profiting off of, but that was years and years of me doing free stuff to get to the point where I could profit off of it. And even with that, I would argue that the $12.99 we are charging is well below the value of what we do. We could probably double that and still have plenty of people signing up. It's not, while I do want to make money, all of us should want to make money. If you don't want to make, if anyone yells at anyone for wanting to make money as a coach, then shut up, because like this is our jobs. Like we have to provide an income. But I do have a passion for education, and I think if you get too gimmicky with what you do and you get too far down a marketing rabbit hole, you can get to the point where it diminishes like your actual relevance, to where every single video Steve puts out, he's just trying to do a market gimmick and make money versus trying to actually educate and try and help people. So it's all a fine line there of how do you become popular, but don't be too gimmicky with that popularity. So.
Okay, so I was gonna say that there's there's a difference between being like a salesperson and being a coach, right? Because like we talked a little bit about, certain methods being very popular. I'm not saying that those methods were designed by people just trying to sell programs, but you have the likes of like Westside, you have the likes of like the Shaker methods as well, and you can very much easily become aligned as a coach who only uses them and become like essentially a methods-based coach. And then you get lifters who come in, they don't necessarily fit that mold, and then it's just like the program's not working for them. And then like as well, as part of your coaching service, you can mass sell programs, mass get people onto your kind of coaching services for like a very cheap fee, right? But I suppose like one thing that I think a lot more coaches are doing now is become way more popular. It's essentially like what Mike T has kind of brought down, like it's like follow the trail of athlete response, and that's where like individualization with programming comes in. Like if a certain method like Westside suits lifter psychology, suits like their kind of cultural norms that they've trained through to date, and they've been getting really good results from that. Like there's no reason to say, hey, we're going to bring you to like a different style of program because I think this is going to be the best periodization style or best training style for you. Kind of go with what they're doing, and like as a result you can have all these kind of different methods and all these different things in your toolbox, as you mentioned there, to help a variety of different athletes progress, right? Because like at the end of the day, your goal as a coach is not necessarily to just write a program, it is to get the person the best result, and you can do that through a variety of methods. It's not too different to in bodybuilding. You have like the high volume, like moderate intensity, or a low volume, high intensity crowd. Both of them can lead to the same result, but both of them are going to suit different personality styles, right? And then that takes the coach to understand which program style is going to help that person develop the best. And at the end of the day, you're there to help the person progress, not to have them defeat your method.
So, fun fact, I love that the high intensity stuff has come back. I was a huge dog crap elitist back when I bodybuilded. If you guys are familiar with dog crap training.
I think everyone, like if you hadn't gone down the rabbit hole of a Dante Trudel forum or been there scrolling through your phone at 2 o'clock in the morning going through it, you haven't lived the life.
That is my favorite training I ever did, bar none, no ifs, ands, or buts. And there's days I 100%. Wish I could go back to that. I say I literally I could, but I can't because I at this point I do not have the ability, like work capacity wise, be able to handle that type of training. I get injured doing anything. But oh god, I loved it. I don't even know how I did. The most impressive thing I ever did, I think, so my best squat ever was, I'm going to try and not be American here, 215 kilos. I think at this point when I was doing dog crap, I could have squatted 170 kilos maybe. And I did, now I really got to math here because this is getting outside my realm of converting. So
385 is 175, I think.
I did 125 kilos on SSB with 170 kilo max for 27 reps. I think it was like a 5-minute set because dog crap, you just literally just stand, like you just stand there for 30 seconds if you need to, and you get another rep. Then you stand there for another 30, and then you lay on the floor for about 45 minutes, and then you go puke, and then you go do your drop set rest pause hamstring curls. So, oh god, I love my dog crap days. But yes, sorry, tangent. You hit a button there with the low intensity bodybuilding because that was the glory days.
I think a lot of the trainees nowadays, and I don't know if there was really something to that for us where you kind of had to really look for information, because if you we kind like when I started training in the gym anyway, it was either you were going over to the biggest lad in the gym and hoping to Christ that he was going to give you some good information and some good pointers, because I grew up in North Cork. It's a little, well, not a little county, it's a county in the southern part of Cork, but we'd no internet until I was about 17, no good internet anyway. So if you wanted to look up a forum, your mother couldn't use the house phone. So you really, really had to go look for it, and you had to kind of nearly almost know somebody that knew someone that read this somewhere. Um, and I do think a lot of the younger kids, them TikTok children coming up now, they're too easy. But but I do feel like it's kind of the golden age, coming into the golden age for kind of good practices and training, that even the average person going to the gym, because of even for like how the Instagram or TikTok algorithm works, they will some if they look for long enough, or they look up powerlifting, they will come across some good coaching advice. They will come across some good lifting advice. It's not all good, but I think it's a net positive. Um, TikTok and Instagram, any of these things, and I suppose for us as coaches, it's a platform for us to kind of advertise and sell our wares. But I think even just if there weren't, if that wasn't the case, and it was just people putting up, hey, this style of training works for me, I think it's positive.
Do you ever go on powerlifting Reddit?
Rarely.
Oh no, I haven't got. No,
So
go on.
it is painful, I will warn you, but I actually do go there for the reason that it is such a different demographic of powerlifters than what we would associate with, and it kind of brings you back to earth. Like, how many of them have no idea anything exists out of 531 and Candido's 8-week program? Or it reminds me that it's very easy to get in your own little circle. And the circle we now have at like a more advanced level powerlifting is pretty big, a lot bigger than it used to be. But there is I'm gonna use my example. Like, my free program that I have, I knew when it blew up when the questions that I started getting completely changed. It used to be powerlifters.
Yeah.
Now it's like the random gym bro, and I'll get DMs all the time. Hey, can I max out after week 4? When do I max out? Like, it's constantly that kind of stuff, and it's a very, very different demographic. And those are the people who are getting like TikTok is their first introduction of, oh, I saw so and so post a TikTok as an influencer about powerlifting, and then maybe they start progressing from there. But it is very interesting. I literally go to powerlifting Reddit to remind me that my bubble is smaller than I think it is. Because I see the bubble there, and it is still people stuck 10 years ago where I was in 2014.
Yeah,
so it is interesting there.
Yeah, that's tonight's rabbit hole started now. So
I apologize, because it's a bad rabbit hole. It's very dangerous. You will want to possibly commit some type of suicidal actions against yourself, but I hope you survive, because powerlifting Reddit's interesting. I occasionally comment there too, and it's always it's a fun one.
You might come out squatting against bands or chains or something horrible like that.
Yep. So yeah, it's a fun one.
I think we covered almost everything. Is there anything else there we want to that we haven't kind of gone over?
I think we've kind of covered everything.
I think the only thing we haven't covered is that I don't know if you guys knew, I went to Dublin earlier this year, and it was one of my favorite vacations ever. The pub lifestyle, I could do that every day. I could quit my job and I could just sit there and eat fish and chips and drink whiskey every day while listening to live music, and I would be a happy person.
Where in Dublin? Were you in the city centre, or were you kind of out and around?
City center. I honestly, me and my wife are gonna go back there pretty soon, because honestly, it wasn't that hard to travel there, and so we loved it. But we also went to Edinburgh,
Nice.
Scotland, we got to spend a lot more time seeing the city there versus Dublin. Dublin, we had a lot more like stuff we did. We did a whole like private tour day excursion going all around to Cliffs of Moher, went through Cork, all that kind of stuff.
Nice.
I really want to go back and spend more time in Dublin. We were actually, I went with another couple who I coached. The husband of the other couple. We were going to try to come out to ABS, but when we got there, we realized it was like a 40-minute drive, and we were going to have to get there at like 3 a.m. to get our workout in before we could even then get back to our what's it called and whatnot. So I want to go back to Dublin and be able to explore it, because that was one of my favorite places I've ever went to. Like I could live there. That's one of the few places I've ever went that like I could just live there for the next year and be incredibly happy.
Let me know when you're in Ireland again, and I'll bring you out to ABS. I'll bring you out to Abs.
All right. Well, literally, if we go back, I probably will. I didn't do it this time because we were so busy. But if we did just a Dublin trip, I probably would do like a free seminar if you guys wanted at ABS, solely so I could call it a business trip and expense the whole thing. I like you guys, and I want to meet you. But like, if I can have a reason to call this entire trip's a business expense, 100%, 100%, I'm doing it.
That works.
Yeah. That's what I'm doing for. I will go to Sheffield. I'm going to Sheffield. I can't even coach right now. I'm going to Sheffield every year I can, because it's just going to be an excuse to an expensive vacation for me and my wife, because we're going to do London this year. If I get to go to Sheffield next year, we're going to do Italy beforehand. And I wouldn't go there if it wasn't for that. So it's a business trip. Boom.
Yeah.
Expense.
It's all tax deductible.
Yeah.
Steve, that was emotional. Thanks so much for coming on. Is there anything else you want to add to that, or do you want to maybe plug your wares there at the end for everyone to tune into?
Sure. Well, appreciate you guys having me on. I like doing this because I don't like on Two White Lights I don't usually get to be the person getting interviewed, so it's fun. I like to hear my voice, I think, too much, so I ramble. But obviously, if you guys want to follow me, PRS Performance. I think the only thing I'll plug is if like this kind of stuff and educational content is what you look for. Me and, like I mentioned, Marcella, Sean, and Matt have Powerlifting Now, and we call it the Powerlifters Library. Literally, the point of it was like, okay, instead of like, where do you go learn about powerlifting? Here's 8 different resources. Just come to Powerlifting Now. We're trying to make it, especially as it progresses year to year, and we have more and more content to where, like, if anyone wants to learn about powerlifting, that's the only place you should go, or need to go. Not should, because there's a lot of other great content. But like, we're hoping that like it pretty much creates the extent to like that encapsulates everything. So if you like this kind of stuff, head over there. But otherwise, like I said, appreciate y'all having me on. I said yes because Ireland's amazing. If you were from France, I would have debated it a bit more. But let's go Ireland.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, man. And when you're over in Dublin, we'll get that seminar set up for tax reasons.
Yeah.
Yep, sounds good, man.
Ever up outside Toronto, that's where I'm living at the moment. So.
Oh, you're up in Canada? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Anyway, right.
You dealing with the CPU fund? Do you still? I'm rambling more, but are you still under the Irish Federation, or did you get the transference of what you're doing, or does it even matter?
I actually competed in a powerlifting American meet in July.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, because
interesting.
I'm an hour away from Buffalo, but the nearest CPU meet that's been on has been like 4 to 7 hours away. Like Montreal is ages away from where I am, and that's where like. I think provincials.
Canada is just one city. Like Americans don't think any otherwise. Like it's Montreal, Toronto. You guys all border each other. We don't know anything different.
I learned the fun fact that Ontario is 15 times the size of Ireland. Like that's just insane to me.
Well, here's the. I was on vacation when this happened. And second, I'm trying to be less violent on Instagram lately. But I saw something. Anatoly called out Ashton saying you compete at home. Like kind of wait until you travel. And I want to be like, going from Ukraine to Malta is like going from Toronto to is like less distance from like Toronto to Montreal or Texas to Memphis. Yeah. Like 100%. Canada and the U.S. are the size of Europe both. Like it's like so yes. Like I completely get it in the sense of like how like Canada's massive, especially the fact that like 95% of Canada isn't even populated, let alone that. So, but yeah, like traveling between is like it's
equivalency. Yeah.
Yeah, like going over to Europe now, it's like crazy to me the fact that it's like a 40-minute flight to go to like any country bordering I want to. That's like traveling just state to state in the U.S.
I suppose it is very much. I was in. Yeah, that's true as well. I was in
But
Denver during the summer at ACSM, and it was fucking mental. We had like flew from Shannon. It was a 9 hour flight to Chicago, hung around in O'Hare for an hour, and then we had a 3 or 4 hour flight then from Chicago to Denver. So even like within the country, to go from kind of East Coast to fairly central, it was still a 4 hour flight. And if you're flying
yeah,
anywhere in Europe, it's
I
about
rarely, I rarely ever fly for the reason that since I live in a small city, I'm gonna have to have a layover, so it's always 7 to 8 hours to get anywhere. So I drive everywhere. It's quicker for me to drive 8 hours than it is to fly and get my flights canceled. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
yeah.
Different. I don't know how we got. Yeah, this is me rambling. We got into U.S. demographics on a technique podcast.
Yeah.
But I'll stop.
Yeah.
I'll shut my mouth now.
Yeah, no,
Great.
that was great.
Thank you very much for listening to the podcast. If you did enjoy it, of course, make sure you follow Steve on all his platforms: Instagram, YouTube. Subscribe to Powerlifting Now. If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure to follow us on Spotify. Leave us a like us, and leave us a rating and a review. And yeah, we will catch you very soon in the next one.